ID. So.
Good morning. Good morning. It'd be great if we all took seats. Good morning and welcome to the third day of N3Con 2023. Yeah. Have you guys had a great conference? Made some good connections? Collected tons of business cards? It's so great to see everyone here. I'm Wan-Ha, the president of the Asia chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. This is our 13th annual N3Con. That means we've hosted it consecutively for 13 years without fail throughout the pandemic, virtually. Our second year here in Singapore, and it's great to see all of you again, so many familiar faces and new ones as well. And really, it's the new folks we want to welcome to this community. We are here, we are building this community for you and because of you and for all of us. And we hope that you are finding strength in this community. We hope that you're finding connection. We hope that you're learning through this community and that you want to help us build it. Because we feel like it's so special, it's unique, it's diverse. We're all very passionate about really fostering great journalism throughout this region. And we want you to be a part of that, a part of our family and a part of the AAJ community and family. So please join us if you're not yet a member. All of this is possible, of course, with the help of our sponsors. And GNI has been a partner and a friend for many, many years. Irene J. Liu has been a fantastic friend to us. And we have a new friend as well, Fazil Ashfaq. Thank you, Fazil, is our host today. Please, thank you so much for having us. And Fazil is going to say a few words, but it's going to be a great day of programming today. Please really connect with one another. And at the end of the day, it's really about giving back to this community and helping to build this community. So please think about how you can play a part in that. Fazil?
Thank you very much, Juan. Hi, everyone. My name is Fazil, and I'm part of the Google team based right here in Singapore. I lead news partnerships for Southeast Asia. So welcome. A warm welcome from all of us. It is absolutely our pleasure to be here. And like Juan said, it is a partnership and a friendship that we have over the years. So just like Irene is an ambassador within Google, there's so many of us that are working. And so I'm here on behalf of a team thanking AAJA for all the work that is done in the partnership over the years. So I'm Fazil, part of the Google News Initiative team based in Singapore. My journey at Google has been about 10 years. 5 years of which have been spent working on news. And so it has been an honor and a privilege to see many moments come and pass in terms of partnerships, helping news across the world. But my personal moment that stands out for me is a personal one. And so the parents in the audience might empathize with putting your kids to bed and then going in an hour later and finding them awake. So my moment happened with my son, put him to bed, and then an hour later I hear some noise coming from the bedroom, go in and see what's up with him. And I found him with a copy of How to Stand Up to a Dictator. And that was this moment where I'm like, you should be asleep, and then I'm like, oh, I'm actually happy about what you're doing. And so it was that moment. I think the parenting moment was one, but what really personally affected me was the connection between the work that we do and real life. So I was able to flip through the book and point out some choice articles, point out some names of folks that had been there. And so for me, that helps me connect the work that we all do, that each one of you does in your capacity, to real world impact and how the story is told across the world. So that was my moment. I think just coming back to the work that we've done as a GNI, our news partnerships team are focused on forging partnerships like the one we have at AAJA across the world. And when we come to, GNI might not be an acronym that a lot of you would be unfamiliar with, but for those of you that do not know, the Google News Initiative has been kicked off 2018, and over the years has helped tens of thousands of news organizations across the world, help them on their journey towards building stronger business models, helping quality journalism, and fostering partnerships with journalists and news organizations across the world. So coming to our partnership with AAJA, it started roughly around shortly after the formation of the GNI. And so since that time, AAJA and Google have partnered to touch directly 3,000 publishers, which is a significant number. And these have been across 18 countries and 18 languages. So the impact has been wide and still continues. We also have partnered in a partnership around the Executive Leadership Program. And so that has been work where 48 Asia fellows have been trained. And so that's something that is familiar to a number of you. And these have included 10 DEI fellows that have been supported each year through the initiative. So without Maria Ressa. So Maria, would you invite you to join us up on stage?
Thank you so much, Fazal. Wow, I am so pleased and honored to welcome to this N3Con stage a courageous journalist whom we have all admired and whose safety we have advocated for and prayed for, has always been on the forefront of our minds. It's so lovely to have you here, Maria.
No, thank you for having me. Okay, guys, I've had 3 cups of coffee, but I landed at 5:30 this morning, so straight out, 20-hour flight.
Oh, geez, I know. But the last time well, let me give our audience some context. Please. Obviously, Maria Ressa's independent digital news website Rappler sounded the alarm on the erosion of press freedom, human rights, and democracy in the Philippines. And because of that, Rappler was targeted by then President Rodrigo Duterte for its stories exposing corruption, cronyism, and online disinformation networks. As Rappler's co-founder and CEO, Maria endured constant political harassment and arrest by the government and was forced to post bail 10 times to stay out of jail and be free.
In like a year and a few months.
Yes. In 2021, she and Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their courageous fight for freedom of expression. That's right. So really, Maria, it's such an honor to have you here, a longtime AAJA friend.
And AAJA.
Yes,
yes. No, first, thank you. It is so good to see so many familiar faces and new friends in the audience. And always so good to see you.
Yes, of course.
Hong Kong, we worry about you. Sorry.
We do. But, to see you here in the flesh, you've had an incredible 2 years, obviously honored with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. She was on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert.
Weird. Oh my God, the first thing you think about when you walk into the Ed Sullivan Theater is, news people don't get things like this. An entire day for that one episode.
I bet.
Money.
You've written a memoir, How to Stand Up to a Dictator. Tell us a little bit about how you're doing since we last caught up in 2020, because obviously you were here at N3Con, but it was virtual. How are you doing? What has been the last 2 years been like, this wild ride?
Well, I guess the first step is thank you to every single reporter who has written about Rappler, written about the Philippines, helped us. Our lawyers were the ones who told us, I don't know how you guys are going to survive the Duterte administration. 6 years, we're still here, and we're still moving forward, so yay. But thank you. You realize that the only defense a journalist has is to keep doing our jobs, to shine the light. And that's just gotten so much harder. How are we? Those 10 cases, 7 are gone. Just January this year, January 18th, I had to walk into a courtroom ready to go to jail for 34 years if it had ruled against me. My lawyers didn't know whether or not I would have been given bail if we had lost that, right? These cases should never have gone to court. That's actually, so let me just quote that, because when I travel, I still have to go to the Supreme Court for approval to travel. And I have a broad restriction on what I can say about the remaining cases or the justice system. So you can ask me later on. I live stream. But 3 cases left. We have another promulgation. In June, there were 5 tax evasion cases. 4 of those tax evasion cases on January 18th went away like that. I was acquitted, Rappler was acquitted. It just took 4 years and 2 months. Shabani was covering a lot of this stuff. It's not over, but it's closer. And then I guess one other part of that is there's a generational change, right? If you're coming into journalism now, boy, we need you. I mean, girl, we need you, and we need your energy at the same time. I see my generation, I see Rich, this morning, we need the people who have been there, especially in Southeast Asia. Fazil is talking about that, and well, everything else. The world has just gotten significantly worse. So it's my 37th year as a journalist, and
that is amazing.
that means I'm
You've been in
old.
Southeast, you've been in Southeast Asia covering for a long time.
For a
doing some
very
great
long
work.
time,
Yes.
and I've not seen it like this. I mean, maybe we can, I hope I don't depress you, but I will be very straightforward about the challenges we face.
Yeah. Is there any sign that the current, now President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos, is there any sign that
Don't
these...
tell me I can't open it, so I'm going to ask for help. Sorry. See, it's hard. She couldn't open it either. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Aunt,
not at
please
all.
go ahead. Let me go back to my seat.
I mean, are there any signs that these cases might be actually dropped against you in this new administration? Because obviously, the threat of prison still hangs over you. The threat of Rappler closing is still very real.
I mean, this is the fun, I hate to say the fun part, but what we learned in all of this, and if you're in a news group under threat, one of the things you have to do is you have to drill your people, right? So every quarter, we do a drill of shutdown. Who does that? We did. I learned this through being in Indonesia, right? You just have to be prepared for what happens. So we literally workflowed what would happen if the police barged in through the door, and then we prepared for it, right?
This is your version of fire drill.
Yeah, literally,
Yeah.
It is our fire drill. So yes, could we still get shut down? Yes. Could I still go to jail? Yes. But I'll quote, if you look at VDEM, it's a report, there are 2 reports that show kind of where democracy is going globally, right? If you look at the VDEM report, it's from University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and if you look at the markers, what they are looking for, the indicators of where democracy is, you'll see that last year they said 60% of the world was under authoritarian rule, 60%. But I thought that includes India and China. Well, India was in between. But so I thought maybe it's not so bad if it's only 60%. But this year, their new report came out, and it moved up to 72%. 60 to 72%. And this is what we are all living through as journalists, and we are on the front lines, right? You cannot not drill. So they did talk about some countries that are emerging out of authoritarian rule. And strangely enough, this one you can clip for my government. Strangely enough, the atmosphere of fear has lifted. Fear does a lot to squash our rights. And the first indicator of a recovering country moving back to democracy is an independent judiciary. And that, again, how can I not feel better when when I just got acquitted of 4 tax evasion charges. They should never have been filed in the first place. That was part of what the decision said. And yet, this is how crazy, how normal weirdness becomes, right? I was relieved that it was gone. Who knows where the world is gonna go, right? Today, what's the news? Elon Musk is now going to be able to test AI in a company he has called Neuralink in people. Did I say this? So who knows? But we keep moving forward, we keep doing our jobs, and we try to encourage the best of who we can be, because the stuff that connects us encourages the worst.
I was going to ask you for your assessment of where things stand, but with that 70%, I mean, that obviously is not
72%.
72%.
Now.
That is obviously not a good indicator. Generally for the Philippines, and obviously now you're looking much broader to helping, make sure that there's free press all around the world. Where do you think we stand in terms of the fight on a free press, especially in the Philippines, but disinformation, and now, of course, the potential threat that AI brings?
Yeah, no, thank you. I came directly from, as in I walked off the stage before it was over at the Nobel Summit in DC to catch the flight that would get me here in time for today. So what was so fascinating about all of this is that this is a time when, we journalists are in the trenches. And you can see that from every single report, RSF, CPJ, right? Every single, there are many more journalists. Free Evan, I just saw your tag, right? There are many more journalists now under attack, who are being jailed, who are being killed. And yet we keep going. Our business model is dead. Did I mention that? Google, the tech and journalism nexus, all of that. We've never faced as many threats as individuals, as news organizations. What's been torn apart has been trust, because the end goal of all of the attacks is to actually tear apart a belief in the shared reality that we have. So in the United States, you will talk about polarization. In the Philippines, we have the same polarization, right? But that comes out of social media. I gotta say, GNI, thank you for being the adult among the tech companies, sorry, But I think tech becomes the match that was thrown into the kindling that is our societies. And that match is burning. And I'll say last thing on the AI. We can talk about this a lot more. I'll be around for a while, right? There have been 2 instances where we've dealt with AI, we collectively, humanity. And in the Nobel lecture, I talked a lot about the first generation, which is curation AI. This is, algorithms, machine learning. It starts with machine learning. It's the machine learning that determines how you grow your feed, what content is recommended for you. So, for example, the polarization in the book, How to Stand Up with a Dictator, one chapter, chapter 7, is how Friends of Friends broke democracy. Friends of Friends is the algorithm that's A/B tested to be the best way for you to grow your own social media feed. When you grow, the entire platform grows, right? But what Friends of Friends did, that one decision polarized our politics, right? And then you have the radicalization that happens on Twitter, on YouTube, which is, they're calling them networked clustered algorithms. So this is the work of Jonas Kaiser, where this is largely in Brazil, where he took a look at how Bolsonaro grew his support base. Very, very far-right fringe figure that was clustered with videos along with every single conspiracy theory you can find that brought him from the far right, so brought the support base to the presidency and onto the January 8th violence, right? We can do this in every one of our countries. That's the first generation. There's so many things that are there, and Frances Haugen's documents, the 10,000 plus documents she released, showed you the impact on kids. the Surgeon General 2 days ago or 3 days ago finally said, what did he say, Bloomberg?
Well, he essentially warned that social media can be very detrimental for children and adolescents, that it can be life-threatening in some cases.
And that is way too late already. So that's the first gen. The second gen, which is generative AI, right? This is the stuff. So I'll talk about it first as Rappler, but then I'll talk about it the way the AI folks talk about it. As Rappler, we used GPT-3 in our May 2022 elections. Because we had 18,000 simultaneous elections, and I have 10 reporters, and I wanted to have a biography on every single candidate. And so about 50,000 pages were created by GPT-3. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see this page was created by GPT-3 and checked by Rappler Research. It didn't hallucinate because we kept the parameters very, very, it just basically had to plug it in, right? So what did I learn in all of that? You have to control it. And controlling it requires your thought, your time, your energy still, not as much as you writing it yourself. And it's boring stuff if you're just doing that. So it can be used that way, but let me put it in the context of exactly how it works in case you haven't looked at it. Because if this first generation was harmful, and it is, it's brought democracy down. This second generation this was exponential. This is exponential in a way our brains can't think about it. Like, sorry, I dove into this because we're still trying. The call I had right before here was still trying to look at how we can use this that is responsible to our communities. So think about the way it works, what makes large language models and what makes this so much better than before was it now thinks when it's writing something word by word, right? So word by word. And I'll use GPT as the OpenAI's kind of parameters because this is what we were working with. We're just switching to Bard now. The Google one is slightly better. Anyway, not for Google, but anyway, so what happened? GPT-2, so this is the parameters. So if it tries to work like a human brain, right? So the two women are on, then it goes through parameters, right? And it's not just parameters per word, but it is also, it cuts across language. So it kind of cuts across culture, if you think about it like this. So for every GPT-2, which was a few years back, is 1.5 billion parameters. Our brains can't do this, right? GPT-3, which is what we used in our 2022 elections, is 175 billion parameters. 1.5 to 175. Look at that. That's exponential. At GPT-3, so that's GPT-3 is 175. GPT-4, which was just released, 1 trillion parameters. And this is the point where they stop releasing what the parameters are. And before the end of the year, GPT-5 is coming out before December. Bard is out. Facebook's AI, their generative AI, was released first, limited, and then it went to open source. And if you've seen this now, think about it like this. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about the atom bomb. Now think that the atom bomb was released open source, and anyone can create it. So let me tell you what the engineers who are working on this have actually said. A few months before OpenAI released the ChatGPT, they released it the same week my book was released, so I was very aware of it. In August 2022, there was a survey that was done in Silicon Valley. Paul, you would probably know this one, right? Like in Silicon Valley, they had this survey. They surveyed about 800 people who were working on AI. And of the people they surveyed, 50% of them said that they were afraid that they could lose control, that there would be a 10% or greater chance that if they released this generative AI, that it would lead to an extinction event of us. An extinction event, right? So I was just with So I was thinking, and you hear Sam Altman say this all the time. There was a reason Google didn't release it publicly. There's a reason why the big companies didn't release it publicly. And then, now here we are, and Sam Altman is going to Congress and saying, going to countries. He was just, I think, in African nation, where he's talking about how dangerous this is. Of course, the question is, well, if it's so darn dangerous, why are you releasing it? Because they're testing it with us as free testers. Right? We're doing the exact same thing. We haven't learned anything. I'm sorry, I can go on this forever, so I will.
No,
please.
I mean, obviously there's obviously a lot of potential for good, but also a lot of potential for evil.
I mean,
right?
but it's beyond evil. It's kind of like atomic energy, like nuclear energy. There's a lot of potential for good. Let's do something that's even better, right? CRISPR technology, genetic research. The two scientists who discovered CRISPR technology, which basically allows you to customize your DNA, so you can customize your baby, they won the Nobel Prize. But almost as soon as they had that CRISPR technology pushed out, regulations, laws were put in place, right? I mean, you've heard me say this forever. This technology that we carry with us all the time, that brought this war to each of us individually. I mean, in the Nobel lecture, I said this is an individual battle. This is less regulations than the toaster that gets in your home. And there I'm quoting the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. We brought him to Manila for World Press Freedom Day, and he just pointed out that there's absolutely the least regulated industry in the world that has made the most money is this. So software engineering. So then since then, I've also been going through these schools where civil engineers, if you're building a building, you have these classes on ethics. You have to actually fulfill certain requirements so that the building doesn't fall down. So we're assured it's not going to fall down. But the software engineers who have access to our emotions, our minds, they don't have any other thing to fulfill other than a business model, other than surveillance for profit.
Do you feel that at this point, social media, technology, AI, are these kind of the biggest weapons that dictators have at their disposal right now?
Wow, we should ask China. And it is not safe for us if we want agency. And that's not me saying it. Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, she wrote this in 2019. That was the first time we had the phrase for the business model. She compares it to the slave trade, that we are owned by the data, right? You guys, if you're really smart, you tend to think that you can't be manipulated this way. We became journalists. This is the thinking slow part. Governance is thinking slow, and yet the insidious manipulation of the big data. And it's ironic we're in Google, but I said they're the good guys of the bad guys. Sorry. No, we just want guardrails in place, because give us a chance.
Well, in your, you have an action plan, right, that you formulated with your co-Nobel, right, Peace Prize winner there, Dmitry Muratov. It's a 10-point action plan to support journalism, end disinformation, and hate speech online. And that plan calls for the end of what you call the surveillance for profit business model and the end of technological discrimination. What would that look like?
I think the first is micro-targeting. This isn't something Google does, but you know how it works, right? Let's talk Facebook, my very favorite frenemy. Rappler, Rappler is still one of the Filipino fact-checking partners of Facebook. But the way it works is that every post you do is pulled up by machine learning to create a model of you. They have a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself. It has all your relationships, and then analytics will fill in, right? So there's predictive things that happen with it. Replace that word model with clone. So what they say is because they used their AI, they then own your clone, and that clone, for all of us in the room, becomes the motherlode database that is used to micro-target, right? This is how the videos are, well, this is the advertising model. Our advertising model in media is nothing compared to the advertising of micro-targeting. It's part of the reason our businesses, say advertising for our news organizations, are just dwindling to nothing because the ROI isn't as good as micro-targeting. But that micro-targeting, that's where you can go to Shoshana's. She has a new paper out, but she's writing a book that should be coming out maybe this year. So she'll show you that micro-targeting takes away agency and free will. The other part that's hard is there are all these other things. You can customize, you can upload your emails in your organization, right? If you have an email, and then they'll look for lookalikes. This is all those marketing tools. They've also been used for information warfare, right? So anyway, let me not, it's a tough world where I think we journalists are fighting uphill because Asian Americans, for example, identity politics has been triggered by information operations and information warfare. I'll push it to America because the data is out on America. In 2016, the Mueller report, look at all of the footnotes of the Mueller report. The Mueller report shows you that 126 million Americans were targeted. Black Lives Matter was targeted, both sides of Black Lives Matter, because it wasn't about trying to convince you of one thing. It was trying to tear apart the fabric of society. What's the best way to do that? Immigration, identity. And here's the last part, and I said this again in 2021 in the Nobel lecture. Online violence is real-world violence. If you are pumping toxic sludge into our information ecosystem, into our bloodstream, that comes out in the real world, right? Women journalists, so the connection there is, look at the shootings that are happening in America. There's several of them that are directly led, that came from radicalization online. They were radicalized online. And then for us, for journalists, for women journalists, women activists, women politicians, Jacinda Ardern in our part of the world, part of the reason she also gave up is because she was a female leader of a Five Eye nation who was being targeted in a way that this technology allows, and frankly wouldn't be allowed in the real world.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. We did AAJA, the Asia chapter of AAJA, did a survey as part of the ANDA project, which is the Advancing News Diversity in Asia. We did surveyed nearly 2,000 journalists in 7 major markets here in Asia, including the Philippines, right? And we found that women journalists said that they face discrimination still, obviously, in their newsrooms, their targets. But cyberbullying online of journalists is a huge problem, and it's horrible for women. It's much more magnified for women. And I'm wondering, obviously, you have been savagely attacked online. To what extent do you think that was magnified because you are a woman?
Oh my gosh, so much, right? We had data from 2017, which was the last time we were really able to pull it, of women journalists in the Philippines were attacked at least 10 times more than men, right? But that, in the end though, male journalists were also attacked. Because the reason why they attack us is two-pronged. The first is to actually astroturf, so to tear down our credibility. This was a big data case study that was done by UNESCO and ICFJ. 60% of the attacks I was getting was meant to tear down my credibility. But the second one is also meant to tear down your spirit, to make you stop doing journalism. And there are many who choose not to, right? Don't. It's funny, the woman who wrote The Chilling, which is the UNESCO report from 2021, there was a book that just came out in 2022. it's a 300-page book. She said every single women journalist she had spoken with cried in some way, except me. And I think the only reason, she asked me why I didn't cry, and I think the only reason was because I had the data, right? I looked at it like as an investigative journalist. And dang, I just happened to be the case study, which was how I discovered it. It's a curse and a blessing, you know? It's gonna get worse. Did I mention that? This generative AI will make it so much easier to pump this crap. And this is my worry is for our communities, our countries in our organizations.
Yeah, and they are going to target women. They are going to target, folks in underrepresented communities because they're easy targets often, and there's no protections.
And in the 10-point action plan, the second big, we brought it down to 3 points. The second one is to stop coded bias, because this is built into the tech that connects all of us, right? If you are LGBTQ, if you are marginalized in the real world, you are further marginalized online.
Yep.
They didn't realize they coded it in, but it is there. I use the phrase coded bias because it's a film. If you're interested, this woman, Joy, and her very long last name, she is Kenyan Canadian. And she was an MIT student who was supposed to study AI. She was given an AI assignment, and she realized that the AI, the computer, couldn't recognize her face because she was a Black woman. Paul, you were there at Sundance when she screened it. Sorry, I see Paul is in my line of sight. So, but you know what she had to do? She had to put a white face mask on, and then the AI could go through.
Crazy.
So stop coded bias. This is all the stuff that is implicit, and here we are, we journalists, trying to do our jobs.
Yeah. What can we do as individual journalists? What can we do? I mean, you've got a 10-point action plan. What can we do to help?
Identify what the real problem is. If you are writing on tech, please write on tech. I think all of us fell into we fell in love with the tech because it was brand new. And it was, I drank the Kool-Aid. In 2012, 2011 was when we were playing with Facebook, but if it had better search, we started Rappler as a Facebook page. If Facebook had better search, then we may not have built the website. I'm glad I did afterwards. But so the first is to be discerning. Let's turn. We tended to give tech a free pass in many ways, like this generative AI again. Sam Altman, sorry, I'm back on my thing. He was telling journalists, American journalists, that this is really dangerous. Not one American journalist asked him, so why are you releasing it? We are making the same mistakes, we as in journalists and democratic nations who should be putting laws in place to protect us. They're consumer protection laws. So that's the first. The second is, this is not the old world where we work in competing news organizations. We are working together. And what we have found, what has worked the best, because I think what Rappler does, what we did in the Philippines, especially since we were under attack already, I felt like we had nothing more to lose. We kept throwing spaghetti against the wall. And you know what worked? When everyone, a whole of society approach. And this is the part that gave me some hope in the Philippines, because even though President Marcos, the only son and namesake of the dictator that my nation ousted in 1986 in a people power revolt, right? So his son comes in and wins overwhelmingly for president. Even though he won, we did this 4-layer pyramid where for the very first time we had 16 news organizations working together. 4-layer pyramid, the bottom was news organizations. We did this with Google News Initiative, right? And then we used Midan, the fact checking, they have a data pipeline. So the 16 news groups, we connected all of our communities, and then the task of each news group was to just pump. They had KPIs for how many fact checks. Fact-checking is a whack-a-mole game, and it's really boring, and it doesn't spread on social media, right? That's why the second layer was critically important. It's called the mesh. 114 civil society groups, NGOs, human rights groups. The church was involved. Businessmen finally jumped in. And the task of the mesh is to take those boring fact checks and share it. Because we have to use what exists today, share it with emotion. And they couldn't use anger. Anger spreads fastest, right? So, you know what we learned in this experiment is that inspiration spreads as fast as anger. And
Powerful.
the third layer are the academic institutions. There are 8 of them. So there was about 150 total that were part of this. But these 8 organizations, the academic institutions, we pumped the data from the news all the way up, and then every week leading up to our elections, they looked at meta-narratives, they looked at who was being attacked and who was benefiting from the attack, the disinformation that was coming out. And then finally, the last one was the law. 6 legal organizations from the left to the right, and their task, the lawyers were so much more excited than the very exhausted journalists at the bottom of the pyramid. One, they made more money. No. The lawyers filed more than 20 legal cases to protect the pyramid, including, another case was just filed, against one journalist, a male journalist who had been attacked by the government. He lived in the provinces, and he came from a small news organization, right? So all of a sudden, we were working together. Here's the part for the news groups. Every single news group grew, because the large national news organizations, we grew because we shared each other's. So you become the tent poles, and then the kind of hyper-local, this is the Baguio Chronicles, the smaller news organizations, they grew exponentially. But then we, the larger news groups, then grew deeper into where those groups are. So there really is something about collaborations. That's the second thing. I think the last one is, you have to take a deep breath and really look around. I spent time with the folks. Jimmy Lai is in prison. You may not, Next TV, like all of the graphics, all of the things, it would have been unthinkable. Apple Daily had more uniques per month than both the Washington Post, the New York Times. It is huge.
This is in Hong Kong.
Yeah, sorry if you.
Media
so
in Hong Kong.
so this is really, of course, when this was happening, the Hong Kong's national security law was put in place the same time as ours was. So I couldn't jump up and down because I kept thinking I was going to get the hammer thrown at me, but I was still jumping up and down. Please know, these are not normal times. And as you have helped support us, we have to help support everyone else.
Maria, you are a constant inspiration.
I'm sorry,
hero.
I talk a lot.
No, this is great. My hero, all of our heroes. Thank you.
No, thank you.
We're going to continue this conversation with Maria, and I'd like to invite up the next panel, which will be talking with Maria on the weaponization of laws and regulation against freedom of speech in Asia. So we'll be hearing more from Maria. I'd like to invite up the moderator for that session, Duya Batar. Thank you. Thanks. I'm sorry, I messed up on the moderator. Shabani Matani, the Washington Post.
You can the rest of the panel up too, or do you want me to call them too?
Yeah, actually, if you call, that'd be great.
Okay. Can Shunhan, Wayu, and Duya join me on stage as well? Thank you. For the really, really great Fireside chat. I'm Shibani Matani. I'm an investigative correspondent at the Washington Post, and I'm very honored to be here at N3Con for I think maybe the third or fourth time as a moderator. So yeah, really, really great to see everyone again. I will be moderating this panel where we will be talking, kind of similar themes to what you guys heard about in the last Fireside chat, talking about how regulations in the law have been used to curtail press freedoms and freedom of speech, freedom of expression around the world. So really proud to introduce this panel here. On my right, Chunhan Wong, China reporter for the Wall Street Journal and also author of a very, very new book that just was released this week called Party of One on Xi Jinping and his control of the Communist Party. So Chunhan. To my left, we have Wahyu Dayatmika, the CEO of Tempo Digital, who's coming here from Indonesia. Thank you, Wahyu. And we have Ressa next to him, who is the co-founder, president of Rappler, as well as the Nobel Peace Laureate from 2021. And next to her, we have Duya Bata, who's the co-founder and chairperson of NEST Center for Journalism, Innovation, and Development, joining us from Mongolia. So yeah, thank you to my panel and welcome to all of you. So, we're talking today about laws and regulations that have been used to kind of clamp down on free speech. But I think I'd like to start off with Chunhan to talk a little bit about China and how really in that case, it's more a sort of extra-legal way of cracking down on journalism and the free press. Chunhan has also personally experienced some of this, having been quite unceremoniously kicked out of China in 2019, so can talk a little bit about what that experience was like. And
my colleague has been detained in Russia for the past 8 weeks, Evan Gershkovich, so anything you can do to help put him in the public eye, remind people that he's still in detention and push for his release, I'll be very grateful. Talking about China, yes, as my friend Shibani mentioned, I was forced to leave mainland China in 2019. I was based in Beijing from 2014 to 2019, and basically what happened was I wrote a story about Xi Jinping's cousin, and that naturally did not please the Chinese government, and it just so happened that the story that was published 1 month exactly before my press pass expired. And in China, they've been increasingly, during the time I was there, increasingly using journalist visas as a way to pressure journalists. So even before I was forced to leave, they were already doing things like shortening the validity of press passes. So there were people who were getting 6 months, 3 months. I even heard of a case of a 1-month visa, which essentially meant you are constantly reapplying. You hardly had time to do anything else. So there were all these actual legal methods they were using to pressure journalists. And in my case, what happened was they told me on the very last day that they won't renew my press pass, so I had to leave. I booked a ticket to Hong Kong straight away. My colleagues were very helpful, came to my apartment, we packed stuff up, went to Hong Kong. And I didn't want this to define me, so the very next day I went out to the streets to cover the protests they were having at the same time. Just as well, since they put me in the biggest news story that was happening, at that moment, so I should go out and do my job. But yeah, using myself as an example, I think you could look at how the Chinese government essentially uses things that don't necessarily seem to, it's not obvious to people. Like, in theory, foreign journalists in mainland China could go out and talk to anyone, visit any part of China except Tibet, and speak to anybody they'd like, as long as the interviewee is willing to talk to them. This regulation was sort of set in 2007, ahead of the Olympics, and then after the Olympics, they made it permanent. And as far as I am aware, this regulation is still in effect. So in theory, by their own rules, there should be no interference with the ability of foreign media to operate in China, in terms of like going out to meet people and talking to whoever you want to talk to. The only restriction is actually Tibet, but they claim that it's because of, it's a high altitude, so people need time to get adjusted and acclimatized, so they set restrictions on who can go. You have to apply and they have to approve, which naturally means foreign journalists almost never get to go. But this is one way they do it, but the other ways they do it is they use surveillance, which is not necessarily obvious to you. They could be obvious if you're, for example, going on a reporting trip and you find yourself like followed by people. This happened a lot to people who went to Xinjiang, for example. There's surveillance where they want you to know, and there's surveillance where they don't want you to know. And in terms of regulations, since that's the topic for today, I think in more recent years we've seen introduction of things like data security laws. Recently, they just pushed out a new counter-espionage law. So these things don't explicitly target journalists, but they have been used in ways that suggest that they could be used against journalists in the future. So we saw, like, for example, the raid against Mintz Group, which is a due diligence company in China. In some ways, they do very similar jobs to us. You know, they find out information on behalf of clients. The audience is just different. They have a very specific audience, you know, for the client that hired them, but we give out information that we find to everybody. So the nature of the job is similar, but they've been targeted by these sort of regulations. So I think, you know, the environment I just described is probably going to get worse. Xi Jinping is, you know, puts a huge emphasis on national security, and we can anticipate, I think, more of such actions being taken against journalists at large.
So, you know, China under Xi Jinping, Hong Kong, the Philippines, they obviously stand at extreme, right, of countries that are using a lot of means to crack down on journalists. Indonesia may not seem like the most obvious example. I think in Southeast Asia, under Jokowi, was seen as kind of a bright spot, really, of press freedom and freedoms in general. But perhaps you can talk a little bit about how there has also been similar weaponization of, you know, free expression and free speech.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sibani. First of all, I would like to thank Maria for that, and it's very inspiring talk. I think you did a great job in explaining the challenges ahead and sort of a roadmap what we need to do together. I think I really appreciate that. I think we have a lot of homeworks to do together in that front. Answering your question, I think Indonesia still has, I think, a mixed review in that issue on how the law is being weaponized against freedom of speech. I think there's two main issues with the legal environment in Indonesia. First, defamation and libel is still a criminal offense. So unlike many countries in Europe or US, where it's a private matters, in Indonesia you still can be arrested for defamation. I think that's a very big challenge that has been there's a lot of efforts, there's a lot of advocacy to try to change that law, but it still happened, and it's still on the latest criminal law that the parliament just issued last year. The second biggest challenge is about the ITE law. So we had a law on electronic information and transaction. There is a provision in that law that regulate hate speech and defamation and manipulated information. So we call it kabar bohong or lies. But the thing is, there is no explanation about what's the intention behind that manipulated facts. So if you are unaware that that you post something online on social media, that it's fake or it's lies, you still can get arrested. So there is no difference between misinformation and disinformation. The police just treat it the same way, and that's being used against a lot of activists. Now, currently, 2 pro-democracy activists is in court because they were accused of defaming the coordinating minister for investment, Mr. Luhut Panjaitan, and they're still facing up to 6 years in prison because of that podcast that they did online.
Duya, I might actually go to you next, because I think in Mongolia there is this kind of similar, you know, setup against defamation of journalists, and we were discussing, you know, social media regulation actually, and how tools to kind of control social media have actually been used and manipulated against journalists.
Yes, thanks for this opportunity, and this is a really great opportunity for Mongolia to kind of get some of the attention, because we are often overlooked, as the world knows us as the oasis of democracy. But our democracy is very young, and our leaders have been watching our better examples in terms of information moderation in the world, and they've got a lot to learn from. What happened is, during COVID, in a situation where none of us knew what was happening, we did not say anything about the information moderation, and we accepted the policy that they had on disseminating information through one channel. So they've enjoyed that for a couple of years, and they just don't want to give that away anymore. So recently what happened was on January 18th this year, our parliament passed a law which is called Law on Protecting Human Rights on Social Media. It happened in 2 days since the public first heard of this law was happening, and until the hammer was hit in the parliament and the law was passed. We wouldn't have noticed that something might have been wrong there if we weren't closely watching what was happening with Maria's decision of the 4 verdicts. Because we were watching that very closely, we've kind of felt there was something similar, something was off with that. So we started looking into that, and this was a 6-page law, which basically claimed to protect children from becoming victims through social media of various crimes. But with the help of lawyers who were open to helping us, we understood that this was a collection of other existing laws that was already working, but with 2 additions. One of the additions being giving our Minister of Justice the right to shut down all forms of communication, post, internet, everything, if he thought there was a situation that threatened our national security. And also, second being to form a unit of a dozen people that would monitor and receive complaints from the public about any sort of fake information on the internet and reply back in 72 hours, which is humanly impossible. And it specifically targeted fact checkers like Mongolian Fact Checking Center, which is our another operation. It said that professional organizations who have special rights of monitoring information on social media will be a part of that. So we are the only organization that works with Facebook in Mongolia, so that means it would basically be us, and we've never been consulted of being part in that law. We did go into a few meetings that we promoted for media literacy campaigns with the help of the government, but they, to a certain extent, cited those meetings as a consultation on the law. So that was a very ugly situation, and we basically rose awareness on that, and the law was luckily vetoed by the president, and the parliament accepted it, but now they're coming back with an iteration of that. So basically things are happening, but the point here is we being kind of praised for being a successful democracy example, not just in Mongolia, but to a certain extent in all of Central Asia. It's very easy for us to overlook such problems and basically become a victim of our own reputation. Yeah.
Maria, you know, obviously you are very passionate about tech companies and having to regulate them and the ills of social media and so on. But, you know, there have been so many examples too, right, of governments in policing that going so far as to start policing the media as well, right? So
Yeah.
where do you think the line should be, you know, kind of drawn with that, right?
Well, first of all, I keep thinking about Mongolia because it's sandwiched between China and Russia. I mean, so you know, I think about this as cascading failures, and we have to look at each of our countries. But part of the reason some of the governments will do this, Singapore's own law, part of that is because there were no controls up here. So I would say it's been hard for me to work as a reporter in the Philippines when we came under attack. And so you can see I'm no longer part of editorial in the Philippines. I don't have an executive editor role in Rappler anymore. I do our data, tech, and our business. So that's what I run our business. But and the reason that's important is because when I look at the long term, I think I've spent more time on laws than I have, I've spent more time with lawyers than I have with journalists. Because the solution to all of this is education, yes. Even the tech companies will say education, but that's long term. Medium term is legislation. And you can't, unfortunately for Asia and Southeast Asia, where our countries have started to fall off the cliff of democracy, I've focused on the supposedly the leaders of democracy globally, right? So that would be the EU, which is, I call them the fastest in the race of the turtles to put legislation in place that will protect us all around the world. And that is the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act that is kicking in place now. Please look at it. I'll share a link with you. There's a clause there that will give real-time data for, it's part of the law. It's section 40.1 in the law that's been passed. But journalists aren't laid out as a group that will get it. It goes to academics. And no offense to academics, but you move really slow for breaking news people. And investigative journalists need it, right? So May 30th, is that tomorrow? Yeah, so May 30th, please just like put in, I'll send you the link, put in for your news organization. Put in for why you need that real-time data, and in that real-time data, I'm talking about a public crowd tangle, right? That's kind of, so that's critical for us as investigative reporters. We need to, because you can't, like, the way people think of data is like, it's like a library book you pull out, and then you have to ask for it. Anyway, that's, so EU, but the United States, which is where these companies are, you know, they're regulating TikTok, but they're not regulating their own companies. So that's, in the short term, we have nothing, and that's part of the reason these countries are also kicking in, because if you think about it, the people who have the power to legislate either don't understand the tech or are focused on the cascading failures, which is coming down to them, right? What will you do if your country gets attacked by Russian disinformation? And it isn't just Russia that's there, right? But that, we certainly have the data. I'll just end with the one thing, which is, let me end with the information ecosystem. Think about it like a river. And content moderation is like taking a cup of water, cleaning that cup of water, and dumping it back into the river. That's what we do as fact checkers. What we need to do is to go up to the factory of lies up here, upstream, and stop it, shut it down, make the factory accountable for the manipulation that is happening to us. Because when you shut that down, then we can begin to rehabilitate the river. The last part is, it is going to be impossible to dictate to every one of our countries, which means we then bear more of the brunt. Journalists and human rights activists. I mean, you know, I say the things that people don't normally say. You know, if you're a large news organization, would you send a reporter to Russia today? The risks, I used to run the bureau for CNN that dealt with sending people into conflict zones. I used to have to evaluate the risks. The risks are also off the scale. So these are some of the things we need to deal with. And the first step to do that is to put the guardrails in place so you protect everyone in the information ecosystem. We cannot fight. We journalists are handcuffed because lies spread 6 times faster than facts. That's an MIT study. I'll tweet that. Yes, I'm still on Twitter. You got to tell me when I should get off.
So one of the things I want to raise, obviously, there's a very big difference between big news organizations and smaller news organizations, right? And, you know, disproportionately, obviously, a lot of these measures, you know, defamation laws and so on, you know, the ones that are local, smaller news outlets are far more vulnerable, right? I would, you know, either Wayu or Duya, please feel free to jump in, but, you know, what is sort of like the economic model like, you know, for journalism in your countries, and how does that make it actually, you know, much more vulnerable, right, to all these attacks and regulations?
Yeah, I think Maria just mentioned it in her talk, that there's almost no business model for media that still exists in this era, because, you know, with the technology rapidly developing, in newsroom we still look at ourselves as a news publisher, not as a digital company. And sometimes we don't have, you know, a lot of emphasis on technology and on distribution. I think that's changing, but coming back to your questions about how the local media, the small independent local media cope with that kind of pressure, it's really worrying. Because we are now in Indonesia start seeing this information desert phenomenon that already happening in the US, where local media just stop publishing real news because they just have no incentive for publishing much needed information for the public. 3 cases of journalist imprisonment in Indonesia in the last 3 years happened in local media. 2 in Sulawesi and 1 in Kalimantan. So 3 journalists are being imprisoned because they were accused of defaming the local mayors or the local district head. And that happened when Indonesia still have the press law that strictly said any complaint against the press needs to be directed towards our press council and not directly to the police. So that's still happening, and as Maria said, maybe the law can be the solution, but in many of our countries, we understand that legislation is not as transparent as it should be. Our member of parliament are not doing their work properly, and so there goes our solution for safeguarding our freedom of speech and this information ecosystem. Because if you don't have a democratic process of legislating a law, then how can you make sure that any laws that being produced in the parliament is for the public interest? So we are in this very tight and a lot of dilemma happening in each of our countries. I would love to hear what happened in your countries in this issue. But I'm sure one thing that learning from each other, we are learning from the Philippines. Maria Ressa has been very generous in her time sharing what you did with your election, and now we are copying your strategy in Indonesia for the next election. So learning from each other is really important. I think we can achieve a lot by doing that.
Yeah, in terms of business, I would say the understanding of ecosystem is pretty young, infant in Mongolia in terms of the media environment, but there are bigger organizations. Like, for example, when I was working for Bloomberg TV Mongolia or with the newspaper, there was a lawyer who normally took care of our business contracts and stuff. But if I was working, if our journalists were working on, so there was one case when we were doing this reporting on a case where there was a drug smuggling and everything. We went to her and asked if there's going to be any legal problems with that. So although she was more in business side of it, she had some kind of expertise or knew the right people. So we did get some sort of help in that regard. For the smaller ones, there is, I would say, no system to protect journalists, and if we were just Mongolian journalists sitting in a circle, there would be at least 60% of us has been called for questioning for what they have written together with their editor. And the law that we now have is called the Law on Conflict Code, but now the defamation and libel case are in discussion to be added back to the criminal code. That's something that we're also looking into as well. But the smaller organizations, they do not have any system in place that would guide them through a process like that. And the result we're seeing from that is the chilling effect. Self-censorship is a huge problem, which we don't even recognize. We had an attempt to kind of look at all the topics and issues that were being covered and whether the journalism in Mongolia was being able to address the issues that needed public attention. And we basically found every news organization was circling around a pool of 30 topics that was always kind of an iteration of itself. So that was a huge issue, and we kind of draw it down to the problem of self-censorship, and which basically over time makes journalists stop thinking. I'm not going to think of anything new. It's not going to go anyway, right? So that's a huge problem that we see, and compared to some extreme cases like imprisonment, like safety issues, we don't see that in that regard. But we are definitely seeing symptoms of things like that happening in Mongolia, and we don't want to wait until we're there and try to dig us out of there. Way of the bottom. We want to be raising awareness, and when our people, audience, are still able to kind of act for their rights to information, we want to be raising awareness. And as Wayu pointed out, collaborations like this, information exchanges like this, and even looking at Rappler's example on January 18th and in the afternoon our law being passed, it kind of opens our eyes to what potential risks and dangers there are. And also the tricky part is the law that I just mentioned. It's a 6-page law. The problematic clauses were not in the law. It had a sentence. Following the approval of this law, clause XX, I don't remember the number, of the digital security law will be amended to say such. So when we're reporting on it, we're not like digging up and looking at the other law. We're just reading the 6-page law and that's it. It's okay, it's not problematic. And we don't have the expertise to even recognize that. Our lawyers are not prepared to help us with that. And now they're changing tactics. Organizations, even media organizations, were not very good at governance, right? So there are other laws that dictate us as a company, financial stuff. We're not really good at that. So there are other like open doors for them to come and censor us. We have to be talking about that now. Libel and defamation, it's pretty well explored field. I mean, not in Mongolia though, but everywhere else. And now they're also looking into other more innovative ways of censoring the media.
So your comments on self-censorship reminds me of, I think one of the most stunning deteriorations in press freedom anywhere in this region, which is Hong Kong. Both Chunhan and I recently relocated to Singapore. We're both Singaporeans, and I think if you had asked us some years ago whether we would relocate to Singapore as an alternative to Hong Kong, that would be a kind of stunning thing to say. But I think it's just testament to how far Hong Kong has sort of fallen, right? And truly like epitomizes the weaponization of lawfare and the law in a way that has really, really targeted journalists more than anything else, right? With the case of Apple Daily that Maria mentioned, but also Stan News. Also, more recently we have like bloggers, Transit Jam, which covered, transport issues, closing down because of pressure from the government. Chunhan, having just moved literally a few months ago from Hong Kong, maybe you can speak a little bit to, how the China model has really kind of being exported to Hong Kong in a big way, or maybe it's different from the China model, but talk to what we've been seeing there.
Sure. I do think to some extent the shoe has yet to fully drop in Hong Kong, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, there's a lot of talk about further media legislation, fake news law perhaps, things like that, or press registration. Obviously this would happen under the rubric of the national security law, because as some of you would know, there was a specific provision in there that calls for stronger management of the media. They haven't explicitly spelled out what that means, but people have asked me like, so you were based in mainland China, and what's it like being in Hong Kong? And my answer was, ultimately the goal is, you could argue, ultimately is one country, one system. So in some ways, what you see in the mainland, you probably can anticipate in the indeterminate future, this will be what will be happening in Hong Kong. So press registration, especially in mainland, is a reality. Like Chinese and foreign media all have to get press credentials. So you could foresee that happening in Hong Kong, perhaps sooner rather than later. But as I was mentioning just now, in China, they don't necessarily have to use like specific media laws to make people, reconsider reporting or punish them for reporting that the government doesn't like. I was just thinking, well, other panelists speaking, I just remembered a case where in 2018 they passed this law called the Protection of Heroes and Martyrs Law, which is a way for the Communist Party to enforce their version of history. And they use this law against everybody. People who go online on Weibo, which is a Chinese Twitter-like app, just saying like, oh, remember the border clash between India and China? Why did they take so long to revealed the death toll. And then that guy was, basically done for insulting the memory of, Chinese soldiers. So like things like that. And that has applied more recently to journalists, or ex-journalists to be more specific. This guy called Luo Changping. He basically, if you remember, there was a very popular movie called Battle at Changjing Lake, which is basically a dramatization of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950 during the Korean War. And he basically posted something on Weibo saying, people don't really understand, people don't question the justification for that war, and basically questioning the official narrative behind China's involvement in the conflict. And first of all, he was called in by police, and then social media, like the nationalist trolls jumped on him, state media jumped on him. Eventually, he was prosecuted and jailed and forced to make an apology. So, things like that, they don't actually have to use very specific press laws. They have a very wide gamut of laws. I remember even going further back, early 2000s. I think 2005, this guy was jailed, a New York Times researcher at the time. He basically did a story saying Jiang Zemin was going to step down as the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and he was eventually prosecuted for leaking state secrets. So as long as they want to get you for something, I think the Chinese government is very creative, and they find all sorts of existing laws to use it against you. So in that sense, it's not really easy for us to know what red line you could cross. It's in some ways quite arbitrary. The red line could shift beneath your feet before you realize it. Going back to Hong Kong, I think it's a bit more obvious. I think partly because of the existing legal system, they do want to demonstrate that one country, two systems still exists, and therefore we will follow everything according to the the legal system we have. Everything is done through the LegCo. We will pass laws that we want to actually implement. So in that sense, it's a bit more above board. You sort of have a better sense of where the lines are. But even then, they're moving quite quickly, as we saw recently with what happened with certain books disappearing from Hong Kong libraries. So I think this is a space we have to watch. We do anticipate, I do anticipate more legislative action in this regard. So whether it's a fake news law, whether it's press registration, or whether it's more prescriptive or more prohibitive regulations on what journalists can or cannot do, I think that's what we're looking out for.
So we have about 20-ish minutes and a very acclaimed and diverse panel. So I would like to invite audience to ask any questions. You may direct your question to a specific person or to the whole panel or to multiple members of the panel. But yes, excited for your questions.
Well, while you're thinking of questions, could I just add 3 points picking up from all of you guys? I think the first is lawfare is already here. It is the dictator's playbook, and we don't have to pass new laws. I mean, those are the cases that were filed against me. They're existing, so they will run after us. The second thing, because we sound so like we are doom and gloom, but let me give you the 2 good things that have happened also from this facts first pyramid. We're gonna need more lawyers. We need legal help. And so looping in the lawyers into a conversation so they do work for pro bono, that's incredible. That's what's helped our news organizations who didn't have the money to pay for lawyers, right? So that's one. The second one is they're going to be more let me not use that word. There are going to be more technical attacks against news websites. And I'll give you the example we had and what we had to do and how the facts first helped also. After the Nobel, so the website, the live stream of the Nobel lecture was DDoS attacked. I tried to get all of the data so that we could figure out where it came from. So that DDoS attacked. After I got back to the Philippines, all the major news organizations were DDoS attacked. We all went down. And so for the first time, what we did was we asked for everyone's data. Where did it come from? And we analyzed it and we helped each other. News groups, large news groups, national news groups don't do that. We need to do that. So that was the first one where we were able to help and find and figure out where the attacks were coming from. But the second thing, please look out for this. And Google will be helpful in this, and Google learned from this also. Toxic SEO backlinks. If you're techie, you know what that means is that they will deluge your website with tens of thousands of AI generated, this is where it can, which it's junk tossed at your links so that your search will be depressed, right? So you don't even, it's very insidious. We were able to help both on the DDoS attacks, the smaller news organizations who didn't have the ability to stand up. We began to pull a tech group that would work with everyone together. That was what the Facts First did. And then the toxic SEO, we need to work together in our country so that you're aware when you are being attacked. Our largest news organizations weren't aware. We alerted them, and then, you know, you go to the tech platforms for help, and then they change their policies. But it's a tough world. So back to the collaboration. It isn't all bad, all right? I'll shut up and you ask us.
Questions? No questions? No.
Hi, I'm Ken Moritsugu. As some of you know, I'm on leave from the AP to teach at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I wanted to ask about the current U.S. government, current U.S. administration under President Biden has been pushing the sort of democracy versus authoritarian situation in the world, and has held summits for democracy and whatnot. Obviously, there's a geopolitical element to this, as well as whatever you think about democracy. But I'm wondering, in this whole debate about democracy versus authoritarianism and freedom of speech, is what he is doing, what the administration is doing, is it just a lot of hot air, or is it actually something useful for the kind of issues we're talking about coming out of all of this?
I can pick it up, and then please, go. You want to go first?
I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong. I don't want to go before you.
Yeah.
Sure, okay. That's a very interesting question for us, especially being, as Maria beautifully put it, sandwiched between Russia and China. So that's basically the situation we're in, and it's a real discussion that's not happening in Mongolia, but mostly outside of Mongolia, with the help of President Biden's administration, I would say. We don't recognize as having authoritarian influence in our everything, information system, economy, finance, legal. We don't recognize that at all yet, but there are definitely people starting to talk about that. And I personally think in the short term, that's helping us, because it's helping us get the attention that we deserve and start the conversation that needs to happen. But my friend who's in the audience was telling me yesterday, is it democracy as a tool or democracy as an ideology? So that's something that we need to be thinking of now, and kind of distinguish whether or not are we like blindly following that narrative, or actually identifying an actual real threat and navigating or mitigating that.
I'll jump in, and because I was part of both the two summits, and the third one, the third global summit on democracy, is coming to Asia, it's Korea. Seoul is going to be doing this, right? So I think the first is this stuff that we're on, the distribution system of the information ecosystem makes you cynical, because it rewards lies 6 times faster. You get the widest reach if you keep lying and if you incite anger and hate. What I like about it, and I am Filipino-American, I am also both, if you believe the information operations, communist and CIA. So take it with a grain of salt. But no, what I like about it is it brings it back to things that our cynicism will pull out. What do we stand for? What are the values that are important to you? And I think every country can take that and make it its own. So focusing on democracy, I take out of it what I need for my organization and for the Philippines, which is we want democratic nations to stand up for these ideals. We don't want them to sacrifice because it is politically expedient. These values shouldn't be. Having said that, in Asia, are we really a democracy, right? We have our own ways of doing it. I mean, it's fantastic to land in Singapore and have, I started covering Singapore with the caning of Michael Fay, the East versus West, right? So I really love covering Singapore in that way. So I guess what I'm saying here is the second summit, which was just happened a few months ago, they splintered into 5 different parts of the world. It wasn't all in DC. What I loved about what Korea did, and I think more of us needed to be part of it, is it focused on corruption. Because frankly, what I'm working on is corruption of our information ecosystem. And then what's the biggest problem? It's money and power, and it is kleptocracy that is the problem, right? So for me, if we find our way in through kleptocracy and stopping kleptocracy, then all the other things fall into place. I go back again to what the root. Seoul is going to have the world's democracy summit next year. And I hope that that's a chance for Asians, for our countries, for journalists to come together. I mean, you know, everyone on the panels I was on talked about corruption. I talked about disinformation and information warfare, and how do we get agency back?
Yeah, if I may add just one more point on that while you get your mic. I think there's nothing we can do about that existing narrative that are being put out, you know, democracy against authoritarian, but what we can do is try to frame it for our objective, which is to create the internet that we imagine, because at the end of the day, it's also about 2 versions of the internet, right? The one that are open, you know, neutral, net neutrality, and you know everyone has the same access, and the other one who's more centralized, and you know people are told what they can access or not. So I think if we can frame it in that sense, I think we can also demand accountability for that narrative. If you want democracy on the internet, then what the tech companies needs to do, what kind of regulation that should, you know, govern the internet in that sense.
Hi, I'm Pamela Marr. I'm not a journalist, although I have lived a long time in Hong Kong, and what's happening in the media there is distressing. However, I'm troubled because in all of this discussion about the truth and the journalist pursuit of the truth and the government cracking down on the media, and I'm sorry you had to go through that in China, I think there's an undercurrent of an assumption that the rational thinking person would know that, of course, truth is good, right? And that they would be able to differentiate that, of course, the treatment you received was unjust. Okay, and to connect journalism to the pursuit of justice is, I think, it's convenient, but I think it's also a bit disconnected because, you know, half of the world is still, maybe not half, maybe like 2 or 3 billion, okay, are still living on GDP of less than 5,000 per capita. Okay, and to them, you know, the pursuit of the truth of what happened in the Supreme Court and like what happened in government and did they actually steal and lie, all of this stuff which, you know, can be the subject of information and misinformation, it actually doesn't make a difference to what happens to those 2 to 3 to 4 billion people. It doesn't help them get more economic opportunity. It doesn't solve their housing problem. It doesn't solve their food problem. The physical versus the philosophical is, I think, something which is, personally, I think it's not sufficiently addressed by what goes for modern journalism. And so my question, I'm sorry to be so challenging about this, but my question is, how does journalism as a practice, including media, actually remain relevant to, I would say, the vast emerging markets where, you know, the population is young, they're ready to be energized, and they need to be educated in order to propel growth so that, you know, we can continue and so that their countries can prosper.
I'll take the first stab, and thank you for the question. You know, the assumption there that we make is that journalists, so better governance will raise the standard of living. And for a while it did. If you look at, you know, I became a reporter in 1986 when the People Power revolt went through, and it looked like, in my career, I watched the pendulum swing from authoritarian one-man rule to democracy, including in Singapore. I covered the end of Lee Kuan Yew, when Lee Kuan Yew handed it, right? Malaysia, blah, blah, blah. Without journalists, so what do journalists do? Please never call us influencers. This is a problem I have. Journalists have a set of standards and ethics. That's how we, and we, this sounds very kind of insider baseball, right? But part of it is our task is to stand up to power and hold power to account for you, so that running water comes to your part of, in the Philippines, for example, right? But here's the problem. Journalism is a thinking slow process, as is governance. I feel as bad for every government official trying to do the right thing, because they have to incite hate in order to get the widest distribution on these, on the social media platforms that everyone is on, right? Everyone saw DeSantis on Twitter with Elon Musk. Anyway, so that's the second. The second one is, I think it's problematic that it is difficult for governments, for anyone to communicate in this environment. That doesn't take away things like the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. We still have to do that, but the UN Secretary General is actually going to declare a state of emergency because we're not going to hit it, because that became significantly worse when the corruption of our information ecosystem happened, right? I was just, two or 3 weeks ago, I was with Al Gore, and he said you cannot solve the climate crisis if you don't solve the democracy crisis. And you can't do that if you don't stop the corruption of our information ecosystem. I spoke ahead of him, so he was talking about exactly this. If we cannot agree that we are in Singapore, and information operations comes in and says that we are in London, but they say it 1,000,000 times, for people who aren't here, they will believe we are in London, and we're not. So that is fundamental. I think you do need journalists to do this, because only journalists are foolish enough to put their freedom and their lives on the line to hold government to account. There's a lot of cascades. It's kind of like I said, the fact that that the problems of the world remain, climate change remains, poverty remains, we're not going to hit the SDGs. It just got significantly worse, right? Because we can now no longer communicate with each other, and we cannot agree on what the problems are. I mean, the last one, and this is, I'm gonna be politically incorrect. In 2014, when Twitter, when everyone was talking about, oh, you're all gonna get your personalized feeds. I kept thinking, wait, does that take power away from news organizations? Don't we determine what the news agenda is for the day? Yes, it did take power away, but think about where it is today now and where it's going to go with generative AI. Everyone will have their personalized feeds, right? If you Google Replika, R-E-P-L-I-K-A, it's a new company where you can build your own AI. They're now going to weaponize intimacy to change your version. What happened during that time period? When everyone has their own version of reality and we don't have a shared space, that's called an insane asylum, right? How do we deal with this? Anyway, okay.
Hi, Paul Chun with the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C. So my question for you is, as the world watch sort of how Philippines and Hong Kong unfold, what do you think the implication is for democracies like South Korea and Japan with media law? Do you think the future of sort of media democracy in Asia, as good as it gets, it might be like a Singapore, which is not great, right? But so what do you see that future is, and how does that influencing Japan and South Korea and Thailand and other sort of democracy right now?
Existing reporters, you want to jump in on that one?
I mean, if I could just add something quickly, and then any of my other panelists can address it. I actually think that, like, in the case of Hong Kong specifically, right? Obviously, because Hong Kong played this role as a hub for the whole region, and there were a lot of media organizations based there, and so on. When the national security law passed, we actually saw very interesting things of a lot of governments trying to claim different newsrooms and lure different newsrooms in with different incentives. Now, I mean, if you can financially incentivize our presence in an individual city or country, then one can hope that at least, in the case of Seoul, right, that they would be more sort of open and more amenable to having journalists and good reporting there too, right? I mean, one of the really interesting things that happened when everybody got kicked out of China with the whole US-China tensions in, I guess, early 2020 was a lot of journalists moved to Taiwan, and then Taiwan had to deal with now having some of the best journalists in the world being really critical and covering them in a critical way, right? So while there was a financial incentive for a lot of these journalists to move there, then the countries have to be prepared for what that means in terms of critical coverage for their own country, right? And I think Singapore is a really interesting case too. I mean, definitely, I had people from Singaporean government saying oh, why don't you consider Singapore? Singapore could be a really good base for you and your colleagues, right? And so sure, now we're here, and now see if you can deal with the coverage that we're going to come up with, right? So.
Yeah, if I may just add one bit of there. I think democracy in Japan and South Korea is much more mature. They have more election cycle, more institutionalized democracy in both countries. I think Hong Kong and Philippines has a different context. It has a different maturity in terms of the democracy that contribute to the deteriorating situation. But I think the same dilemma that are faced by our colleague in Japan and South Korea is going back to the previous questions about relevance. I think that is the question that we all are facing. How do we make journalism relevant in this day and age? Because how do we only produce information that people want? How do we make sure that? How do we know that what people want to know? What do people want to read based on the trending topics or the keyword on SEO is the right size or the right kind of information people need? So the balance between what people need to know and what people want to know is still a big, I think, question in many newsrooms. And then how do we finance the business model for that kind of information? Because if you only look at SEO or referral traffic for websites, then you will end up doing only what people want to find out on the internet. So that's a big dilemma for many newsrooms, and I think until we can find the right balance, then there's still a big question mark on relevance.
Japan did something unthinkable when I was a reporter, and this was leading up to on Murayama and below, right? They're spending money on defense in a way that they never did. I hope Korea steps up and actually takes the principles of democracy, Asian style. There's an author that lumped Singapore into the dictatorships. You remember which book this was recently? I'll find it and tweet it for you. But I think, again, we find our own way. I hope what this time does for us is that we have the ability to take charge, right? That there is now no one. I mean, look, my American friends are talking about end of empire, but because in the end, we're looking at, so here's what the numbers show us. Let me end with this one, right? Which is that if you follow all of the Freedom House report, the VDEM report, if you follow elections, and if you follow that we don't have integrity of facts. So if you don't have integrity of facts, how do you have integrity of elections? Then you go down to, in the doomsday clock for democracy, we're in the last 2 minutes. And the last 2 minutes of that will come down to 2024. Starting January this year, there are 90 elections all around the world. We just had Thailand. We just had Turkey and Thailand. Who did better? Thailand actually did, right? But the opposition in Turkey was devastated by what they had. Indonesia, so Indonesia in 2024 becomes a super critical elections. India becomes super critical. And then the United States. Those are the three that we're looking at as a tipping point. Japan and South Korea. South Korea has the opportunity to do more, but they have the same problems that governments all around the world have, that the UN has. The very processes for checks and balances slow everything down, and the changes that are happening at lightning speed. So this is our problem as reporters as well as journalists. Sorry, I'll do one last thing, which is connected to why you talked about business model. We're in Asia, the Global South. Please apply for the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is this, hi Irene, that's the person you need to talk to. But the International Fund for Public Interest Media was something we began in 2019. Last year, our goal there was to go to democratic governments and get them to give new money while we're sorting out what's happening with the laws to independent media. Last year, we raised $50 million. And the first 11 grants went out already, and you know the person who's in Asia Pacific.
Great. So on that note, I would like you to join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much. And yeah, they'll be around. So.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists and the moderator. Just a few housekeeping announcements. We are going for lunch now, and so it will be in the main Google Hall. And this afternoon we still have a very dense program, and I hope you will join us. We have no less than 7 different sessions. 3 sessions in particular that are precisely about how journalists can collaborate and work together. So there's a session about how to conduct joint investigations, a session about how to build a network of freelancers in Asia, a session about community-led
you.